The unexpected encounter. Julian Parker adjusted the cuff of his custom-tailored charcoal suit, his expression one of practiced indifference, as he surveyed the opulent interior of Vellum and Vine, the newest and most exclusive restaurant in downtown San Francisco. Chandeliers gleamed overhead, refracting light across the polished silverware and the porcelain plates that adorned each table. The quiet hum of conversations, low and restrained, flowed around him like a symphony of privilege. Across from him sat Nadia Laurent, a stunning brunette with striking blue eyes, who looked every bit the heiress she was. Her designer gown shimmered subtly in the low lighting, and she sipped her Bordeaux with the kind of refined grace Julian had come to expect in the circles he now inhabited. "This place is extraordinary," Nadia said, her voice velvety but aloof, as though compliments were currency she dispensed sparingly. "The waiting list for Vellum is nearly impossible. How did you pull this off?" Julian offered a small, enigmatic smile. "Let's just say it pays to know the right people." He omitted the part where he'd shelled out an egregious amount to a charity auction for the reservation. For Julian Parker, venture capitalist, media darling, and self-made millionaire, appearances were everything. Wealth wasn't merely a tool, it was armor, and tonight he wore it effortlessly. Yet, as Nadia began discussing her upcoming art gala, a glittering event that promised to be the talk of the city, Julian's attention drifted. It was subtle at first, a flicker of motion in his peripheral vision, but something about it tugged insistently at him. His eyes shifted involuntarily to a figure weaving between tables. A waitress. Julian's breath caught in his throat. She moved with precision, balancing a tray of cocktails with both confidence and care. Her black uniform was immaculate, pressed to perfection, but there was something strikingly familiar about her. Even as she dipped into a polite nod toward the guests she served, Julian noticed the slight fatigue in her posture, and most importantly, the protective way her hand occasionally drifted toward her abdomen. It couldn't be. His heart pounded as his mind grappled with the impossible. It had been over a year since he'd last seen Emily Lane, his ex-wife. Yet there she was, unmistakably the same despite subtle changes. Her once rounded cheeks were slimmer, and the smile she wore looked carefully practiced rather than natural. Her jet-black hair was gathered into a low bun, exposing the delicate lines of her face that he'd once traced with reverence. "Julian?" Nadia's voice broke through his haze, sharp but measured. "You're miles away." "I'm fine," he said quickly, though the tremor in his hand betrayed him. He placed his wine-glass down to steady himself, but his gaze was drawn inexorably back to Emily. She hadn't noticed him yet, too busy tending to a table of executives with the kind of practiced deference the service industry demanded. But as she turned slightly to deliver a drink, her profile came into full view. Julian's world tilted. She was pregnant. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He blinked, momentarily stunned, as questions erupted in his mind like an unstoppable storm. How far along was she? Was she okay? Why was she here, working, especially in her condition? And most damning of all, why hadn't she told him? "You look like you've seen a ghost," Nadia commented, though her smile didn't falter. "Business troubles?" "No." The word came out clipped, harsher than he'd intended. Nadia arched a perfect brow, but didn't press. Instead, she pivoted gracefully back to the topic of her gala. And for once, Julian was grateful for her ability to carry a conversation without much input. It allowed him to sit in silence, mind spinning. Emily was here, pregnant, and working. Their marriage had ended just over a year ago, after months of arguments, growing silences, and miscommunications that had finally turned irreparable. He had justified their divorce to himself and to others by claiming that they had simply grown apart, that his world and hers no longer aligned. But deep down, Julian knew better. He had left because of pride. Emily, with her unwavering idealism and focus on substance over appearance, had refused to compromise who she was for the glossy facade of his life. She called him out on it time and again, questioning his priorities and his obsession with wealth as a marker of success. "You're not the man I married," she'd said during their last fight, her voice trembling but her gaze steady. "Or maybe I never really knew who you were at all." Those words haunted him now as he watched her move through the restaurant, her exhaustion barely hidden beneath the facade of professionalism. Seeing her again, pregnant and working so hard, shattered the carefully constructed excuses he built around their failed marriage. What happened after I left? The question burned in his mind. Emily had been brilliant, an aspiring attorney with a sharp mind and fierce determination. How had she ended up waiting tables? The Emily he knew would have never given up her ambitions unless something had gone terribly wrong. At that moment, as if drawn by the weight of his stare, Emily turned. Their eyes met. Time seemed to freeze. Julian saw recognition flash across her face. Surprise first, followed by something else. Pain. She recovered quickly, her expression smoothing back into the neutral politeness demanded by her job, but the moment was enough to punch a hole through Julian's composure. For a heartbeat, it felt as though they were the only two people in the room. "Julian." Nadia's voice snapped him out of it once more. "Honestly, you're a million miles away tonight." "I'm sorry," he muttered, trying to force himself back to the conversation. "I've just had a long day." But as Nadia continued, Julian couldn't stop himself from sneaking glances toward Emily. He watched her exchange orders with the kitchen, pour water for a nearby table, and smooth her apron with a shaky hand. Every small detail added weight to the ache in his chest. She's pregnant. She's working herself to exhaustion. And I wasn't there. For the first time in years, Julian Parker, a man who had carefully controlled every facet of his life, felt entirely, terrifyingly helpless. Memories and consequences. The air outside Vellum and Vine was crisp and biting, but Julian barely noticed the cold. His breath formed faint clouds in the dim light as he stared unseeing at the street ahead, the elegant murmurs of the city's elite fading into irrelevance behind him. Nadia had gone, irritated but too polite to show it fully, leaving him alone beneath the glow of the restaurant's exterior lights. He couldn't get Emily out of his head. Pregnant. Working here. Her image played on a loop in his mind. Her faint smile, the weariness she tried to hide, and the unmistakable swell beneath her uniform. It gutted him. What had happened after their divorce? How had things fallen so far for her? He had to know. "Mr. Parker." The valet appeared, impeccably dressed, and holding open the door to Julian's luxury SUV. Julian blinked, realizing he had been standing still for far too long. "Keep the car for a moment." "Yes, sir." He turned back toward the restaurant, his feet moving on impulse. Julian didn't know what he would say or if he even had the right to speak to her at all, but leaving things unresolved was not an option. Inside, Vellum and Vine had begun to settle into the lull that followed the evening rush. Julian scanned the room until he found her. Emily stood near a small server station, flipping through handwritten tickets and checking her watch. She rubbed her lower back absent-mindedly, fatigue etched into her movements. A manager, broad-shouldered, middle-aged, and wearing a cheap blazer, appeared beside her. His voice was loud enough to carry as he barked instructions. "Hurry up, Lane. I need those tables turned." Emily flinched slightly but nodded, mumbling an apology before gathering a tray. Julian's jaw tightened at the way the man sneered at her, as though her exhaustion was a personal inconvenience to him. Before he realized what he was doing, Julian was moving toward her. "Excuse me." Emily froze mid-step, her shoulders tensing. Slowly, she turned to face him, and their eyes met once more. Up close, Julian could see the faint circles under her eyes, and the way her uniform seemed slightly too loose in places and stretched in others. "Julian," her voice was calm, but it carried an undercurrent of disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Julian searched for words, but they didn't come easily. "I saw you." "I gathered that." She shifted the tray in her hands, clearly eager to escape. You should go back to your date. I have work to do. Wait. Julian stepped in front of her, lowering his voice so no one else would hear. Emily, you're pregnant. A flicker of something. Anger, maybe, crossed her face. Brilliant observation, Sherlock. He deserved that. Julian swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. Is it mine? Emily stared at him for a long moment, the noise of the restaurant seeming to fade into silence. Finally, she exhaled softly, as though the weight of the question had been pressing on her for weeks. Yes. The single word hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd suspected it, of course, calculated it, even, but hearing her confirm it made the truth impossible to ignore. How far along are you? He asked, his voice barely audible. 7 months, Emily replied tersely. And before you ask, no, I didn't tell you because I didn't want your pity or your money. Julian felt something twist deep in his chest. Pity. Emily. It's not. Please don't, she interrupted, holding up a hand to stop him. I don't want to do this. Not here. Not now. Her manager's voice rang out from across the room. Lane. Table 12. Emily gave Julian one last look, her expression a mixture of hurt and resignation, before stepping around him and disappearing into the dining room. Julian didn't sleep that night. Back in his penthouse apartment, a sleek, glass-filled space perched high above the city, he paced restlessly, his thoughts a chaotic tangle. Emily's words echoed through his head. I didn't want your pity or your money. Had he really left her with so little that she'd felt she couldn't come to him? He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sank onto the leather couch, staring at the city lights glittering below. The view was magnificent, million-dollar buildings, shining streets, and endless possibilities stretching out beneath him. Yet tonight, it felt hollow. 7 months. The timeline unraveled in his mind, pulling him back to their final days together. The divorce had been quick and brutal. Emily had cried. He remembered that much, though she tried to hide it from him. Why are you giving up on us? She had asked him during their last real conversation. You're the one who refuses to see reason. He'd shot back, defensive and cold. We're too different. You're not willing to compromise, and I can't keep fighting for something that isn't working. In truth, he hadn't been fighting at all. Emily had wanted something real, a life built on love, trust, and shared purpose. Julian had been chasing an image, clinging to the kind of wealth and status he thought would make him whole. He hadn't seen the cost of those choices until now. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped being the man Emily fell in love with. And now she was alone, carrying their child and waiting tables just to survive. The next morning, Julian made a decision. He arrived at Vellum and Vine just as the restaurant opened, dressed in a far less polished version of himself. No tie, his shirt sleeves rolled up. The hostess gave him a curious look as he asked to see the manager. "Can I help you?" barked the same man from the night before, who clearly hadn't forgotten how to scowl. "I'm here to speak with Emily Lane." The manager's frown deepened. "You mean Lane, the server? She's not scheduled for another hour." "Why?" "That's none of your business," Julian said, his tone cool. "I'll wait." The man opened his mouth to argue, but something in Julian's gaze stopped him. "Suit yourself." Julian took a seat near the back, ignoring the confused glances of the early staff setting up tables. When Emily finally walked through the door, her hair loose and a coat wrapped around her slight frame, she stopped in her tracks upon seeing him. "What are you doing here, Julian?" "I want to help." She gave him a look of pure incredulity. "Help?" "Yes." Julian stood, searching her face for any trace of the girl he'd fallen in love with years ago. "Emily, I know I don't deserve your trust, but I need to do right by you." "By us." Her laugh was bitter. "There is no us, Julian. You made sure of that." He swallowed hard. "Maybe I did, but I still care about you, about the baby." Her eyes softened, but only slightly. "Caring isn't enough, Julian. It never was." Julian exhaled, steadying himself. Then tell me how to fix it. Emily looked at him for a long moment, as though trying to decide whether or not he was worth the effort. You can't fix what's already broken, she said finally. But if you're serious about being part of this child's life, then start proving it. Don't just say the words. Show me. She turned to leave, but before she walked through the back doors, she glanced over her shoulder and added, "And stop showing up at my job. It's embarrassing." Julian smiled faintly, despite himself. There's still some fight in her. And for the first time in years, he felt something stir in him too. Steps toward redemption. Julian sat in the back seat of his SUV as it wove through the crowded streets of San Francisco, but he wasn't really there. The city's familiar noise, honking horns, the hum of engines, snippets of conversation, blurred into white noise as his thoughts circled the conversation with Emily. Show me. Two simple words, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of failure and regret. Emily had given him no room for empty promises or shallow gestures. She'd always been like that. Direct, honest, unrelenting. It was one of the things he'd once loved most about her, and one of the things that had scared him enough to push her away. Where to, sir? His driver, Andrew, asked, breaking the silence. Julian hesitated, his instinct pulling him back toward his office, toward the empire he built, the meetings and deals that waited. But for the first time in years, those things felt secondary. Drop me off in the Mission District, Julian said, surprising even himself. The mission, sir. Andrew's brow furrowed in the rearview mirror. Are you sure? Julian nodded. I need to find someone. The Mission District had a stark, grittier edge that Julian had long forgotten. Gone were the pristine glass buildings and luxury boutiques of his usual haunts. Here, small businesses lined the streets, bright murals splashed across brick walls, and people bustled about with a different kind of purpose, one rooted in survival, not appearances. Julian walked the blocks with his hands stuffed in his pockets, searching for a familiar name or clue. Emily had mentioned years ago, before their marriage, that a friend's law clinic helped lower-income clients fight housing disputes and legal injustices. She had volunteered there during law school, before her career took off. It wasn't much to go on, but he needed to start somewhere. At last, he found it. The San Mateo Justice Center. A faded sign hung over the door, and though the building was small and worn around the edges, it was buzzing with life. People crowded the lobby, clutching documents, and talking in hurried whispers, desperation in their voices. Julian hesitated as he stepped inside, uncomfortably aware of his expensive shoes and tailored coat. This wasn't his world anymore, but he forced himself to move forward. A woman behind the front desk, a sharp-eyed Latina in her 40s, looked up from her files. Can I help you? I'm looking for someone, Julian said carefully. Emily Lane. She used to volunteer here years ago. The woman's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing slightly. Why? Julian ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. I'm her ex-husband. Her eyes softened, just a fraction. Emily doesn't work here anymore, but I remember her. She was one of our best. What happened to her? The woman sighed, setting down her pen. Life happened. Emily was brilliant, top of her class, a rising star. She cared about people in a way most lawyers don't. But after her firm let her go, things got tough. She tried to find other jobs. But you know how this city works. If you're not connected or playing the game, it's easy to fall through the cracks. Julian's stomach twisted. Why didn't anyone help her? The woman's gaze sharpened. People tried. But pride is a funny thing. Emily never wanted handouts. She wanted to earn her way back, and she refused to let anyone see how much she was struggling. Julian swallowed hard. It was so Emily. Do you know where she's staying now? He asked quietly. The woman hesitated before scribbling something onto a notepad. I probably shouldn't do this, but you seem like you care. She's renting a room at this address. Julian took the paper, murmuring a thank you before leaving. As he stepped back onto the street, the afternoon sun felt sharper, harsher, as if mocking him for his ignorance. An hour later, Julian stood outside a small, aging apartment building in a neighborhood that had seen better days. The paint on the exterior was peeling, and a rusty fire escape clung to the brick facade like an afterthought. His chest tightened as he climbed the creaking stairs to the second floor, stopping in front of a door marked 2B. He knocked softly. There was a pause before the door opened, revealing Emily. She was out of her work uniform, dressed in a faded sweater and jeans, her hair pulled into a loose braid. She looked tired but startled to see him. "Julian," she said, crossing her arms over her chest protectively. "What are you doing here?" "I told you I wanted to help," he said, his voice steady but soft. "And I'm here to start proving it." She stepped back slightly, allowing him into the small apartment. The space was sparse, a single bed pushed against the wall, a modest table, and a stack of second-hand books in the corner. Despite its simplicity, the apartment was clean and meticulously organized. Julian's throat tightened. Emily had never been one for extravagance, but seeing her living like this, with their child on the way, made something inside him ache. "Are you here to throw money at me?" she asked, her tone wary as she sat on the edge of the bed. "No," Julian said, taking the seat across from her. "I know you don't want that. But Emily, you're working yourself to exhaustion, and you're 7 months pregnant. That can't continue." Her gaze flickered downward for a moment, but her voice remained firm. "I'll be fine." "You shouldn't have to just be fine," Julian countered, his frustration bleeding through. "Not alone. Not like this." Emily looked up at him then, her expression softer than before. "Why are you doing this, Julian? Guilt? Obligation?" He shook his head. "Because I messed up. I let you down when you needed me, and I've spent the last year convincing myself that I was justified, that we were just too different. But that wasn't true. I was a coward, Emily. I let other people's opinions and my own pride ruin something good." Her eyes searched his, as though trying to measure the sincerity of his words. "And what do you expect to happen now? That you'll swoop in and fix everything?" "No," Julian admitted. "But I want to try. I want to support you and the baby, however you'll let me. I want to do better, for both of you." Emily stared at him for a long, heavy moment. Then, to Julian's surprise, a faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Words are easy, Julian," she said softly, "but I'll give you a chance to prove you mean them." Relief flooded through him, though he knew this was only the beginning. "Thank you. And for the record," Emily added, her voice firmer now, "I don't need saving, Julian. I need someone who's willing to stand beside me." Julian nodded, understanding what she meant. "I'm here. For as long as you'll let me be." For the first time in years, Julian felt like he was finally standing on solid ground, not because of wealth or status, but because he was finally choosing what mattered. The weight of change. The following days were a blur of action and awkward silences. Julian had promised Emily that he would stand by her, and for once in his life, he was determined to follow through. But words were easier than actions, and Julian knew that earning Emily's trust back would be a long uphill climb. He started small. The first morning after their tense conversation in her apartment, Julian was parked outside her building by 6:30 a.m., steaming coffee cups in the passenger seat of his car. Emily, dressed in her work uniform and bundled in a worn coat, froze when she saw him leaning against the SUV. "Julian," she said with a sigh, her breath forming visible clouds in the crisp morning air. "What are you doing here? Stalking me now?" He held up the coffee cups, attempting a faint smile. "Bribing you with caffeine." Her eyes narrowed, but she approached cautiously. "What do you want?" "To drive you to work, just for today." Julian's tone was earnest, free of the usual arrogance she associated with him. "It's cold. The bus stop is 2 blocks away. You don't have to say anything or even look at me if you don't want to, but at least let me give you a ride." Emily stared at him for a moment, clearly trying to gauge his sincerity. "And tomorrow, you'll show up again and make yourself part of my routine." "Maybe," Julian admitted with a small shrug. "One day at a time." Against her better judgment, Emily climbed into the car. The car ride was quiet. Julian didn't push her to talk. He'd already realized that words weren't what Emily needed. She needed proof. She clutched the coffee cup he'd given her, sipping occasionally as she stared out the window at the passing city. Julian stole glances at her when he could, noticing the way her hands shook slightly when she adjusted her grip, the way exhaustion still weighed on her features. "Have you seen a doctor recently?" Julian asked carefully, breaking the silence. Emily turned to him with a guarded expression. "Why do you care?" "Because I want to make sure you're okay," Julian replied softly. "And the baby, too." Her shoulders sagged slightly, as if the question had pierced some of the invisible armor she always wore. "I've been going to the free clinic near my apartment. They've been good to me." Julian's jaw tightened. The words "free clinic" rattled around in his head, and all he could think about was the resources, his resources, that Emily didn't have access to because of him. He didn't say it, though. He'd learned quickly that Emily didn't want pity. Instead, he nodded. "That's good. But if you ever need anything, any help, will you let me know?" She didn't respond, but her silence was softer than before. Over the next few weeks, Julian found himself breaking free of the carefully constructed life he'd once clung to so tightly. His days were still filled with meetings and investment portfolios, but his evenings had become something else entirely. He started small, showing up outside Emily's apartment to drive her to and from work. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand anything. He was just there. Sometimes she accepted the rides with minimal conversation. Sometimes she turned him away entirely, but Julian kept showing up. One night, as he waited for her shift to end outside Vellum and Vine, he noticed the manager, the same smug man from before, berating her in the back corner of the restaurant. Julian's blood boiled as he watched the man jab a finger toward Emily's chest, his voice audible even through the glass doors. Enough was enough. Julian pushed his way inside and approached the pair. The manager turned, startled by his presence. "Sir, you can't just. I'd appreciate it if you'd stop shouting at your staff," Julian said coolly, his voice low but dangerous. "Especially her." The manager's face flushed red. "This is none of your business." Julian smiled, a sharp, predatory thing. "That's where you're wrong. As of this moment, it is my business. Consider this restaurant under my interest." "What are you talking about?" "I'm buying it," Julian said matter-of-factly, pulling out his phone to text his attorney. "And when I do, the first thing I'm doing is replacing you." Emily's eyes widened in horror. "Julian, what the hell are you doing?" "Fixing a problem," he replied calmly. "I don't need you to fix my life," Emily hissed, grabbing his arm and dragging him out the front door. "You can't just waltz in and throw your money around." Once they were outside, Julian turned to her, his expression pained. "Emily, you don't deserve to be treated like that. You're pregnant, and he was yelling at you like..." "Like what? A waitress?" she shot back bitterly. "Because that's what I am, Julian. I'm not a lawyer anymore. I don't need you to bulldoze your way into my life and fix things that aren't yours to fix." Julian fell silent. Emily took a deep breath, clearly trying to calm herself. "Look, I get it. You're trying. And part of me appreciates that. But you can't just use your money to solve everything. Life doesn't work that way." "I know," Julian said softly. I want you to know that you don't have to do this alone anymore. I'll be here, however you'll let me." Emily stared at him for a long time before her expression softened. "You want to help? Then stop treating me like I'm broken. Let me decide how I want to fix my life." Julian nodded. "Okay, I'll do better." Weeks turned into a routine. Julian didn't buy the restaurant, though he did ensure that the manager was reported for mistreating staff. He didn't throw money at Emily's problems, but he found quiet ways to help, bringing her meals when she was too tired to cook, connecting her with a lawyer who helped her negotiate better maternity leave options, and quietly paying off her medical bills without ever telling her. Emily, for her part, began to thaw. Slowly, cautiously, she let Julian back into her life. She told him about her clinic visits and the baby's progress. She let him feel the baby kick one evening, a moment so raw and beautiful that Julian nearly broke down. One night, as they sat in her small apartment, Julian looked at Emily and said softly, "Can I ask you something?" She glanced up. "Sure. Why didn't you tell me?" "About the baby." Emily exhaled, setting her tea down. "Because you weren't ready, Julian. Back then, you cared about the wrong things. And I didn't want you to feel trapped. I needed to prove to myself that I could do this, even without you." Julian nodded, his throat tight. "And now?" She smiled faintly. "Now, I'm starting to believe that maybe people really can change." For the first time in years, Julian felt like he was on the right path, not because he'd fixed anything, but because he was finally learning how to stand beside someone he cared about, instead of trying to control them. And as Emily's due date drew closer, Julian realized something else. For the first time in his life, he had something real to fight for. The cracks of vulnerability. The final weeks of Emily's pregnancy brought a strange sense of calm, a fragile peace that hung delicately between them, as though the slightest misstep might shatter it. Julian, for once, stayed true to his word. He didn't push, didn't demand, and didn't try to throw his wealth around to fix things. Instead, he showed up. Every morning, he waited outside her building, coffee in hand, ready to drive her to her appointments. In the evenings, he brought groceries, not because he thought she couldn't do it herself, but because he knew how exhausting her long shifts had become. He didn't hover or insist on staying. He simply was there. Emily, always guarded, had started to let him in. On a rare afternoon off, Julian had convinced her to take a walk with him at Golden Gate Park, promising her fresh air and time away from the constant chaos of the city. The park was serene, its sprawling green pathways dotted with families, joggers, and elderly couples strolling hand in hand. The sky stretched clear and endless above them. Emily walked slowly, one hand pressed protectively against her belly. Julian stayed close, keeping his pace matched to hers. "You've been quiet today," he said softly, breaking the companionable silence. Emily glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "It's strange, being here. Relaxing. I don't remember the last time I did this." Julian's heart ached at the quiet honesty in her words. "You deserve to take a break, Emily. You've been carrying too much on your shoulders for too long." "Carrying too much?" she teased, arching an eyebrow. "You're not talking about the baby, are you?" He chuckled softly, though the humor didn't fully reach his eyes. "Maybe a little." They paused near a small wooden bench beneath an oak tree. Julian gestured for her to sit, and she lowered herself with a grateful sigh. He took the spot beside her, watching as a group of children played tag nearby. For a while, neither of them spoke. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of flowers and freshly cut grass. Emily broke the silence first. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she said, her voice quiet, "about what happens next." Julian turned toward her. "What do you mean?" "The baby," she replied, looking down at her hands. "About how I'm going to make it work. Raising a child while working full-time, managing bills, staying sane." She trailed off with a humorless laugh. "It's overwhelming when I let myself think about it." "You don't have to do it alone," Julian said softly. Emily's gaze flicked toward him, wary but searching. "You keep saying that, Julian. But why? Why now?" The question hit him like a gut punch, not because it surprised him, but because it was one he'd been asking himself over and over. Why now? Why did it take seeing her at rock bottom for him to wake up? I wish I had an easy answer, he admitted finally. But the truth is, I didn't see things clearly before. When we were together, I was so focused on building a life that other people would envy that I didn't realize what I already had. I pushed you away because I was scared of losing everything I thought I wanted. And now, Julian said, his voice steady but raw, I realize I lost the one thing that mattered most. You, us, and this baby, this second chance. It's the only thing that feels real anymore. Emily's expression softened, but she looked away, her fingers tracing a loose thread on her coat. You say that now, but what happens when things get hard? When the baby's crying at 3 in the morning and I'm too tired to move? When life stops being neat and pretty and starts getting messy? Julian's gaze held hers. Then I'll be there. I know I don't deserve your trust, Emily, and I'm not asking for it all at once. But I'm not going anywhere. Not this time. She searched his face for any trace of insincerity, but found none. After a long pause, she exhaled deeply, as though releasing a weight she'd been carrying for far too long. All right, she said quietly. We'll see. It wasn't a promise, but it was a crack in the walls she'd built around herself. And for Julian, it was enough. A week later, Julian was in the middle of a board meeting when his phone buzzed. He normally kept it muted during work, but today something had made him leave it on vibrate. He glanced down at the screen and felt his heart stop. Emily. At the hospital. Baby's coming early. Julian shot to his feet so quickly that every head in the room turned toward him. Julian? One of his senior partners said, his tone sharp. What's going on? I have to go, Julian said, already gathering his things. Family emergency. He didn't wait for their response as he strode out of the conference room and into the elevator, his pulse pounding in his ears. By the time Julian reached the hospital, he was breathless and frantic. He practically jogged through the sterile white hallways, searching for Emily. A nurse pointed him toward the maternity ward, and when he reached her room, he froze in the doorway. Emily was sitting upright in bed, her face pale but determined. Sweat beaded her forehead, and she was clutching the arm of the nurse beside her. Julian, she said through gritted teeth when she saw him. You're here. He rushed to her side, his heart pounding. Of course I'm here. How are you? Is everything okay? Emily grimaced as another contraction hit, her fingers tightening around his hand when he offered it. Everything's fine. The doctor says it's just early labor, but they're monitoring us. Julian looked helplessly at the nurse, who gave him a calm, reassuring nod. She's strong. They both are. Julian turned back to Emily, his expression softening. I'm not leaving. Whatever you need, I'm here. Emily met his gaze, her defenses momentarily stripped away by exhaustion and pain. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to lean on him, if only for a moment. You'd better mean it, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I do, Julian said softly, brushing a strand of damp hair from her forehead. I'm here, Emily. Always. Hours passed like a haze. Julian didn't leave her side, even as the labor intensified and the night wore on. He stayed through every contraction, holding her hand, whispering encouragement, and proving in the small, quiet moments that he meant every word he'd said. Finally, just before dawn, the air was split by the first wails of a newborn baby. It's a girl, the doctor announced, carefully wrapping the tiny, squirming infant in a blanket before handing her to Emily. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she cradled the baby in her arms. Julian hovered close, unable to take his eyes off the child. His child. She was small and perfect, with a head full of dark hair and a cry that made Julian's heart swell. She's beautiful, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Emily looked up at him then, something unspoken passing between them. Do you want to hold her? Julian hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as Emily carefully passed the baby into his arms. He held her close, his heart nearly breaking at how fragile and precious she felt. In that moment, Julian Parker, a man who had once defined himself by his wealth and success, realized that nothing he had ever built or earned compared to this. This was real. This was everything. A new beginning. The morning sun broke through the hospital window, casting soft golden light across the room. Julian sat in the corner, cradling his newborn daughter in his arms. The tiny bundle, wrapped snugly in a pale pink blanket, breathed softly, her little fingers curled around his thumb. He stared at her in quiet awe, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: pure, unfiltered joy. For most of his life, Julian Parker had measured success in numbers, profits, investments, and assets. Yet here, in this sterile room with peeling paint and beeping monitors, he realized that true wealth wasn't found in bank accounts or luxury cars. It was found in moments like this, holding his daughter, her warmth seeping into him, grounding him in a way he never thought possible. Emily stirred slightly from the bed, her tired voice breaking the silence. "You look ridiculous, you know," she said softly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "A billionaire in a designer suit, holding a baby like she's made of glass." Julian looked up, his expression sheepish but soft. "I don't want to break her." "You won't," Emily assured him, her voice gentle. "She's stronger than she looks." He looked down at the sleeping baby again. Like her mother. The room went quiet for a moment, the weight of those words lingering between them. Emily watched him, her dark eyes searching his face as if trying to figure out what was different. Something about him had shifted, and she couldn't deny it anymore. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked after a while, breaking the silence. Julian shook his head, but there was no trace of exhaustion on his face. Not a chance. How could I sleep when she's here? He glanced at Emily. "When both of you are here." Emily looked away, focusing on the IV attached to her wrist, as though unwilling to let him see the tears glistening in her eyes. "It's been a long road to get here, Julian." He stood and gently passed the baby back into her arms. The sight of Emily holding their daughter, her features soft, her walls momentarily down, made Julian feel like a man seeing color for the first time. "I know," he said, sitting beside her. "And I can't change the past. I can't undo what I did or how I failed you." Emily's expression flickered, her gaze dropping to their daughter. "So what now? You said you wanted to prove yourself, but Julian, this isn't just about words, or even showing up for a week, a month. This is forever." Julian nodded slowly, his voice steady. "I know that. I don't want to just be someone who drops in when it's convenient. I want to be her father. I want to be a real part of your lives." Emily sighed, stroking the baby's tiny cheek. "You don't know what you're asking for. Parenthood isn't easy. It's late nights, sacrifices, tears, and doubt. It's watching your child grow up and feeling completely unprepared." Julian reached out and took her free hand gently, his voice soft but unwavering. "Then I'll learn. I don't expect you to trust me overnight, Emily. And I won't lie and say I'm not scared. But I've spent too long hiding behind a life I thought I wanted. That life doesn't mean anything without this, without you, without her." Emily blinked back tears, her voice shaky. "And what if you decide it's too hard? What if you decide this isn't the life you want?" Julian squeezed her hand gently. "I've spent my entire life running away from what matters most because I was afraid of failure. I failed you once, but I won't do it again. I don't care how hard it is, how much I have to change, or how long it takes. I'll be here." For the first time in months, maybe years, Emily let herself believe him. Not completely, not yet, but enough to let a crack of hope slip through her carefully guarded heart. She looked at him, her face raw with emotion. "You're going to have to earn this, Julian. Every single day." "I know," he whispered, "and I will." Over the months, Julian's world transformed in ways he never thought possible. Gone were the endless late nights at the office and the high-stakes meetings that once defined him. His life now revolved around a small, fragile being who demanded everything from him and gave him back more than he ever thought possible. He rented a small, comfortable apartment closer to Emily's neighborhood, not a penthouse or anything flashy, just a space where he could spend time with their daughter. He wanted to be close, available, and present in a way he had never been before. Every morning, he found himself changing diapers, stumbling through feedings, and panicking over the tiniest coughs and cries. Emily found his clumsy attempts at fatherhood equal parts hilarious and infuriating. "You're hopeless," she said one night, watching as Julian struggled to get the baby into a onesie. "Hopeless but persistent," he replied, grinning as the baby finally settled, gurgling contentedly in his arms. Emily's smile lingered longer than usual that night. The unexpected proposal. It wasn't a grand gesture, not the way Julian Parker of the past would have done it. There were no violins, no candlelit dinners at exclusive restaurants. Instead, it happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Emily was sitting on the floor of Julian's apartment, sorting through a pile of baby clothes, while the baby played on a soft blanket beside her. Sunlight streamed through the window, bathing the room in a warm glow. Julian sat nearby, watching them both with an expression that made his heart feel too big for his chest. "I was thinking," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. Emily looked up. "About what?" Julian hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "About how lucky I am to have this chance, to have you both in my life." Emily's gaze softened, but she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I know we're not perfect," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "And I know I still have a lot to prove, but I want to spend the rest of my life proving it. To you, to her, to myself. I don't just want to be her father, Emily. I want to be your partner too, if you'll let me." Emily froze, the baby clothes forgotten in her lap. "Julian, I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow," Julian added quickly, holding up his hands, "or even next year. But I want us to build something real together, something better than what we had before." Emily stared at him, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she stood and walked over to where he was sitting. "You're a stubborn man, Julian Parker," she said softly, a smile playing on her lips. He looked up at her, hopeful but uncertain. "Is that a yes?" Emily shook her head, laughing lightly. "It's a maybe, but you're on the right track." Julian smiled, a real, genuine smile. And as Emily leaned down to kiss his forehead, he felt a surge of hope unlike anything he'd ever known. Epilogue. 1 year later. The small house smelled of freshly baked cake and vanilla frosting. Balloons floated lazily across the ceiling, and the sound of laughter filled the living room. "Daddy," a small voice squealed. Julian turned just in time to catch his daughter as she toddled toward him on unsteady legs, her dark curls bouncing wildly. He scooped her up, peppering kisses on her cheeks as she giggled uncontrollably. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," he murmured, holding her close. From across the room, Emily watched them with a soft smile, her arms crossed as she leaned against the doorframe. Julian caught her gaze and smiled back, his heart full. He had spent so many years building an empire of wealth and power, thinking it would make him whole. But here, in this small, cluttered house surrounded by laughter and love, he knew the truth. They were his greatest success, and he would spend the rest of his life proving it.